Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming to History's Lunch. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Welcome to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here in the two Mississippi Museums. Throughout the month of May, only a couple of more days in the month, Entergy is sponsoring free admission to the first 95 people who come to the museums each day in honor of their 95th corporate birthday. So please take advantage of that. Wednesdays tend to be one of the slower days on regular attendance at the museums. Get a lot of school groups, but there are free tickets out there for folks. So ask about that after this if you're interested in taking advantage of that. And speaking of school groups, summer is here. And that means children who are happy to be on vacation and parents who are looking for things for those children to be doing. So this Sunday from 1:30 to 5 o'clock, the Museum of Mississippi History will offer the first installment of its Summer Sunday series, Nature, Weather, and Natural Disasters. Families can participate in hands-on activities, games, and presentations that include constructing a tornado bottle, hurricane mapping, and levee demonstrations. And that is all free with your admission to the Museum of Mississippi History. You can ask out front about details. For you longtime History is Lunch attendees, you will appreciate this news. Timothy Davis, who has made the coffee, put out the cookies, and generally taken care of all of us for the last almost 4 years, is moving down the hall to bigger and better things into the finance department. So we will still see Timothy around as much, but if you have thoughts on the strength of the coffee or the type of cookies, you will now want to mention that to Nathan Weber, who has been around for the last year or so as well, and not Timothy. I hope that you will all be able to join us next week for our History is Lunch program when Joseph Crespino, the author of Atticus Finch, the biography, will be with us to present Atticus Finch and American History. Today, to present a behind-the-scenes look at the Starkville Civil War Arsenal, a private museum that opened in 2009 and focuses on the field artillery carriages that made up Union and Confederate battery. Duffy Neubauer holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and is the retired administrator of Mississippi State University's Humphrey Coliseum. He has published numerous articles and reports on artillery and black powder, including in The Artilleryman, the only periodical dedicated to the use of vintage artillery. Neubauer leads Turner's Battery, a living history unit he established in 1988. Along with being a live round shooter, he is a sought-after artillery consultant and public lecturer. Help me welcome Duffy Neubauer.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I have to warn you, I wander. I don't stand behind podiums too good, so I wander around a lot. But I wanted to thank Chris Goodwin and his staff for what they've all put together. I worked 36 years on campus at Mississippi State, and nobody ever knew me there because I was the one that set up all the tables and the chairs and got the building ready. And then when everybody left the building, then we went back to work cleaning up all those tables and chairs. So I immediately recognize when I come into a facility, and I'd like to compliment our audiovisual people and our sound people. They can't happen. Programs can't happen with those type of people. So I'd like to thank Chris and their... I'd also like to thank all of you. I'd like to thank you for investing your time in coming to listen to me speak about my passion. I have to admit, this is a big crowd like this. What a wonderful opportunity. And I know what a preacher must feel like on Sunday morning when he's got the church full. And he gets to give that sermon, and he's excited, and I'm excited to come and talk about my passion, the field artillery of the American Civil War. And probably I know what some of you are thinking right now. I can read your mind, some of you. You're thinking right now, he's not from around here. He's not from here. And people always ask me that, and I tell them, well, where are you from? And I said, Starkville, Mississippi. They go, yeah, but you were someplace before Starkville. And I always remind them, I said, I was born and raised in the South, and they don't believe that either. Southern Wisconsin is where I came from. But I am excited to tell you about Starkville Civil War Arsenal. And there's two displays that I brought in I'd like to mention. You maybe took a look at them. One of them is kind of like the 800-pound gorilla, but we're not going to talk about that until the very end, and that's the ambulance. And you might be thinking, why does an artillery museum have an ambulance? And I'm going to talk about that more. And the other picture that I brought down was just kind of a last-minute thing. I was picking up some stuff last night, and I knew a dear friend of mine and one of yours here, Jeff Gambrone, is here, and I happen to have a picture of Jeff Gambrone firing an original 30-pounder Parrott at Camp McCoy in northern Wisconsin. If you look at that photograph, out in front of the muzzle, you'll see this big black spot. That's not a problem with the photography. That's the projectile in flight, because we were shooting at targets about 1.5 miles away. I like to tell everyone that comes to the Starkville Arsenal, when they come out there, I love to tell them that the Starkville Civil War Arsenal is the largest artillery museum in Ottawa County. But there's a lot of people don't believe me, especially from Starkville. I've tried to get people from the Chamber of Commerce or Tourism, and they don't buy that, the largest artillery museum in Ottawa County. But I also tell you this, that collection is the only collection in the United States where you can see every piece of rolling stock and the support vehicles in one place at one time. And I started to get that idea after the people from the National Archives had come in to visit, and the people from the Smithsonian came to visit, and the people from the Army Museum came to visit, and the National Park Service. And they all said, if people come in and want to see all these different carriages, especially the guy from the Smithsonian, he said, I'm going to have to tell them they've got to go to Starkville, Mississippi. So I want to, obviously, I'm going to try and encourage you to come look at it, but for some reason that you can't come there, you can always look at it online. It is a collection. I've been collecting 45 years, and in 2009, I decided that for me to collect all this equipment and store it didn't make any sense. It needed to be shared with the public for those that had a passion like I did, that wanted to come in and see these different types of carriages. Because I have reenactors come all the time that have been reenacting for 25, 30 years in the artillery, and they come and they see forges and battery wagons, and they say, you know, I've seen these in pictures, but I've never actually seen one, and I've been doing this for 30 years. So I opened it up. Now, for you Civil War buffs, you'll understand this, and for you people that maybe aren't real tight with the Civil War, I'll explain it. I opened up, this is a brilliant marketing ploy on my part. I opened up on April 12th, first day of the Civil War, at 4:30 a.m. It's when Fort Sumter was fired on. So I thought, that is a natural. Open up at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th. Well, I have to tell you, nobody came. But that didn't discourage me. I've continued on. And at this point right now, I have a map of the United States. And every time I get a resident from a state, I color it in. I'm up to 40 states. I've had 40 states. I think I've probably had 8, 9, 10 different foreign countries. And just this past week, I've scheduled a tour. I'm now international. I'm having a group from Germany come in July. They speak some English. I speak no German, so it's going to be an interesting day. But let me jump ahead, and Chris told me that no one could mess this up. It's so simple. That's the visitor center, what I affectionately like to call the visitor center. When you come to the facility, you make an appointment. My telephone number's on the website. And when you make that appointment, you tell me, the tour guide, if you want a Confederate soldier, if you want a Union soldier, if you'd like to have an artificer, and an artificer is like a skilled craftsman. The battery had blacksmiths, they had carriage builders, they had saddlers, they had farriers. So I would dress as a work person or a maintenance person. So I let the audience pick the soldier they want. They can pick a program. When they come into the visitor center, I usually do a small presentation, sometimes with my Aunt Irene's 35 millimeter slide projector. And when I get a group of Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts and I get teenage kids in there and I turn on that 35 millimeter projector and they see that picture up on, they are in awe because they cannot figure out how that works. They've never seen a slide projector. But after about a 10 or 15 minute introduction, we open up and I say, let's go, and I send them off and I try and collect them at the end and do some type of a question and answer program. Now, in the museum, I like to think I have a total approach to field artillery. Most people, when they think about artillery, they think of just a cannon. And they forget there's a lot more than just a cannon. It's just like in the Air Force. You think of that one guy flying that jet fighter up there. Well, there's probably 15 people on the ground doing maintenance. They're putting weapons. They're servicing it. They have air traffic control. And the artillery was the same way. There's a lot of support in the artillery. And I always break the artillery down into 3 different phases. One of them is the manpower, the people or the personnel. One of them is the rolling stock or the different carriages. And one of them is the livestock. If you don't have 100 plus horses, all that equipment you have is just a stationary monument. So you had to have horses. So I have a lot of pieces there that pertain strictly to the livestock. And I do programs on just horses and mules, if you like horses and mules. This is part of the collection of the carriages. And these carriages may look all the same to you, and they do to most people, but they're different sizes, and they're referred to as a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3. And the very first carriage, which you can't see, is actually a Mexican War carriage. And so all of the field artillery pieces that the federal government purchased had to fit on one of these 3 carriages. And the gun that probably gets the most response or people ask about is that bronze gun in the middle. It's a 1857 model light 12-pounder, quite oftenly called the Napoleon. You Civil War buffs know that Napoleon because that was probably the most used gun. But what is interesting about it, and I always get their attention, I always ask my audience, have you ever heard of Paul Revere, that famous ride? And they go, sure, everybody knows Paul Revere. I says, that, and Chris told me I have a pointer on here too. That Napoleon was made by the Revere Copper Company in Boston, Massachusetts. The same company of metalsmiths and silversmiths. They were still pouring bronze, and they're still in business today, and I'll bet you some of you have their products. The Revere ware, the pots and pans with the copper bottom, same family. But that is what most people think of as when they think of artillery. They think of the cannon. And that's just the beginning. Whoop, I think I hit too many here. How do I get rid of that? Hold it? I bet I hold it, right? I warned them about me and technology. This gun right here is a Confederate gun. Thank you, Chris. I want to get through this. This is a Confederate gun. And remember I told you that those carriages had to fit, if you were a manufacturer, it had to fit one of those carriages. Well, the Confederacy, when the war started, they didn't have any foundries. They had one foundry in all of the South, so they had never made cannon. So they've just, went to war with the United States, and they pressed a lot of foundries into service. Over 30 different foundries went into service producing cannon for the Confederacy. But they didn't follow the specifications real good, and sometimes the guns got a little bit too wide, maybe not big enough, and hold your ears just a little bit. Those were referred to as bastard carriages because they only could fit one tube. So when they made this cannon, and that's a Brennan 6-pounder cast in Nashville, Tennessee, and they got done and they said it doesn't fit on any standard carriage. They said, don't worry, we'll go to our local carriage builders and they'll build a carriage for it. Well, that's fine until you're out in the field, damage the carriage, and no other carriage can be used. Interchangeable parts is a pretty good idea today. It was a very good idea back then. This is a caisson. I'm very proud of this caisson, and I got to brag on it just a little bit. This caisson has buried 4 American veterans. First time I did it was the Hunley Burial. I believe it was in 2005. We brought the Hunley up. There were sailors on there, and they said, we want full military honors, which meant horse-drawn caissons. And I learned a little something just 2 days ago. I always knew that America has this tradition, we do not leave our dead on the battlefield. And from the time of George Washington, that has been the sentiment in the military. So when they had no ambulances or special wagons, they carried the bodies off the battlefields by putting them on the caisson. What I did not know is in that for early years in the Continental Army, they also thought it was a disgrace to have the bodies exposed. And one of the easiest and quickest things they had to cover the body was the American flag. So they put the American flag over the body of the soldier as he rode off the battlefield in the caisson. And it was kind of not undignified, but to think about it, that has become the most dignified burial that can be done in this country today. And if you go to Arlington National Cemetery, they do over 1,500 burials a year. And every one of those burials is done off of a caisson with an American flag draped over the casket. So the first time I did a burial was the sailor Arnold Becker. Arnold Becker was the sailor right behind George Dixon. When the submarine came up, they wanted full burial, so we participated in that burial. One of my guests today, David Lindley, was also a member of that caisson detail. One of the most spectacular events of my life. I can't even explain it. There were over 8,000 people in the procession. There was between 15 and 20,000 people along the procession route. And when we got to the cemetery, they closed the cemetery to no more people. They had over 25,000 people in the cemetery. 5 miles we walked from downtown Charleston out to the cemetery, and it was as quiet as a church. The only thing we heard was our feet. And that was an eerie feeling to be in the presence of thousands of people, and it's absolutely dead silent. I'm going to pick things up the next time I buried a soldier, because I said, well, that'll never happen again. Right over here, there's an actual picture of a tombstone. Wesley Gilbert. Wesley Gilbert is United States Colored Troops. He was a black soldier. He was stationed in Vicksburg, Mississippi, died there, and at the end of the war, he's buried down at Grand Gulf. And there were a few stones that were literally on the edge of the bluff, and they're ready to wash into the river. And they had to be reinterred. The state of Mississippi asked if we would be interested. We said, just tell us when to be there. So we went down and buried Wesley Gilbert. We moved him into the cemetery about 150 yards. We calculated he's good for about 250 years of erosion. So he'll be safe as long as I'm alive. And then probably the most unbelievable story is the middle one. And what that says is Mexican War, and it gives the date. I buried 2 Mexican War soldiers. Hurricane Katrina, we all know Hurricane Katrina, blew up onto the Gulf shores at Biloxi, 4 coffins. And when they opened up those coffins, they knew exactly what they had. They all had Mexican War buttons. They knew that there were Mexican War soldiers buried off the barrier islands of Mississippi, and they knew exactly what they had, and they reinterred those soldiers into the National Cemetery at Biloxi. So again, the state of Mississippi asked if we'd be interested, and we were down there with bells on our toes, and I went down there. So I have buried American veterans off of that caisson, and I'm very proud of that. Now here's one of the support vehicles. The caisson, I should have spent maybe a second more. The caisson is basically a vehicle that transports ammunition. And we've all heard that song, when those caissons keep rolling along. It transports ammunition, or it's a support vehicle. This is also a support vehicle. It's called a battery wagon. To simplify it as simple as I can, it's Lowe's on wheels. They have over 500 different tools and parts in this wagon right here. And this limber right here, that chest is filled with tools. So whatever they could rebuild spokes, they could replace axles. They had 3 disciplines in the battery: the blacksmith, the carriage maker, the woodworker, the saddler, and all of the tools that they needed was in that battery wagon. Now, I love telling this story. I have school groups, I have teachers, and I don't think out of the 9 years I can count on 2 fingers that anybody that ever walked in and they knew what that flag was right there. How many know what that flag is? Less than that. That's the state flag of Mississippi from 1861 until 1894. That's a long time. And that flag right there, this flag right here, everybody says, oh, I know what that is. That's the Bonnie Blue flag. I says, no, it's not. It's the Lone Star flag. The Republic of West Florida. How many have heard of the Republic of West Florida? All right, we got some history people here. West Florida adopted that flag. They were going to be a completely free and independent. They were owned by France, Spain, the U.S., and they said, wait a minute, we're tired of this. We're going to form our own republic, and we're going to use the Lone Star flag. Well, we all know the Republic of West Florida didn't make it. The flag disappeared until a little engagement over in Texas called the Alamo. After the Alamo, sometimes people forget this, Texas was a republic before it was a state. And when they formed their republic, they kind of liked that Lone Star flag. And if you look at the state flag today of Texas, the Lone Star flag is still there. Now jump ahead. It's January of 1861. Mississippi has just seceded from the Union. And down in Jackson, Mississippi, blocks from where we're at, there was almost a Mardi Gras atmosphere. Bands were playing, shooting fireworks, they're celebrating, and someone gets the bright idea to take the Lone Star flag and run it up the flagpole on the state capitol. Well, there happened to be in the audience that night a man, he was an Irish minstrel, his name was Harry McCartney. He didn't know what the politics was going on, but he could see enthusiasm. And he thought about it, and he went to his motel room that night, and he says, I have to perform tomorrow night. I want to do something special for my performance in Jackson, Mississippi. I want to write a little tune. It's called the Bonnie Blue Flag, the flag that bears a single star. Comes back the next night, sings the Bonnie Blue. It's an instant success. Second most popular song, all of the South, only behind Dixie. And now you think, you know, the rest of the story's coming. 2 weeks later, the state legislature has to form a government. I mean, they have to come up with a constitution. They have to come up with a flag. And somebody comes up with the bright idea, well, let's make a flag. We're the Magnolia State, and we'll put a magnolia on it. Well, that's not a bad idea, but that didn't sit well with a lot of people. They couldn't get that Bonnie Blue out of their brain and seeing it above the state capitol building. So they wanted the Bonnie Blue. So they did something politicians would never do today. They compromised. So they said, okay, we'll put the Bonnie Blue up in the corner. We'll put the magnolia in the center. We'll put some red trim around it. And until 1894, that's the state flag of Mississippi. And most people don't recognize it when they come in. Here's a vehicle. Most people look at me when I tell them that the battery traveled with a forge. They had a complete operating blacksmith shop. And they say, okay, I kind of get it. You know, you're going to break something. You can weld it. You can make bolts, nuts, nails. They had heading tools, taps, and dies. I said, well, you're on the right direction, but you're thinking of forgetting one obvious thing. All of those horses all have 4 hoofs, and they have to be shod every 4 to 6 weeks. So most batteries, a 4-gun battery, a small 4-gun battery still has over 100 horses. A 6-gun battery, you could be approaching 120, 130 horses, and every 6 weeks, those shoes have to come off and new ones on. So this forge was a vital, vital piece of equipment. It has a bellows, 2-chambered forge in here. This handle pumps the bellows, and this is the firebox right here. And obviously, all of the tools for the blacksmith shop are in this limber chest, and you can see my anvil right there. You can even see a couple of shoes hanging on there. People have a tendency to forget about all of those horses because artillery is a mounted service branch. People kind of forget that too. I did it again. That's all right. This part is probably my favorite part of the, when you start out and you're real young and you go fishing and you were 5 years old and you went fishing, you didn't care how big the fish were. You just wanted to catch a lot of fish. So you'd go to that pond and you'd catch 50 fish. But as you get older and older, you realize it was more sporting to maybe find that one big fish. And as I got older, I'm getting there. As I got older and older, I realized that this artillery is a bigger picture. And I got interested in the support aspect. And these boxes of tools, I have about 150 to 175 period tools. My wife says, do we really need any more tools? And I says, absolutely. We're just getting going. So this photograph right here is one of the impressions that I do as an artificer. I'm a maintenance person. And the maintenance people, I always kind of test the Boy Scouts. If you're shooting a battle or participating in a battle and you're going from point A to point B, when was all of this maintenance done? Because if the wheels are turning, we can't work anything. It's done at night. It was done at night, which means they used lanterns. So if they worked all night and they moved during the day, you've already figured out something. They learned to sleep on these carriages. They learned to take a little nap here and there, but they were exhausted because they were kind of burning the candle at both ends. So I have a special place in my heart for all of the people who do the support, all the people that were behind the scenes. It's kind of like setup men in a building that set up the tables and the chairs and they do the sound. Nobody ever thinks of those people. As soon as I walked in here, I saw this beautiful, beautiful room. And I looked at and I saw, oh yeah, I can see where the audiovisual hands, and I can see where all the support, because I had 36 years of that. So that's kind of a special place for me, is the maintenance and the support of the battery. This program right here might be my favorite. And if your mind is a little twisted, maybe like mine, and you think that this would be an interesting 30-minute program, I have a program for you. It's called The Anatomy, Maintenance, and Repair of a Civil War Wheel. Every part of the wheel, every time I start pushing this button, Chris gets a little nervous. I'm going to try there's the wheel. Every part of that wheel is on that table, and you can see how many parts. Wheels are such a vital part of the artillery. And you go, it's just a wheel. These wheels have to be greased every 250 miles. That means every carriage that you saw in there, every 250 miles, all the wheels come off, they get greased, and they all go back on. They don't have odometers on there, so many batteries just took a certain day. They said, if it's Monday, we're greasing wheels. So every one day of the week, they would pick and grease wheels. But I love wheels, and if you have any passion for wheels, you need to come and see me at the Starkville Arsenal. This vehicle right here, I don't know what I'm doing, Chris. I'm hitting it too hard. This vehicle right here is the unsung hero of the war. It's the supply wagon. And the supply wagon is that vehicle that carried all of the ammunition. It carried all of the hay for the horses. It carried all of the ammunition. Let's go back to that little 4-gun battery. It just has about 100 horses. They eat 1 ton of hay a day, every day. They eat 1,500 pounds of grain every day. Don't feed them for a while, they'll be okay. But after a couple of weeks, they start losing weight. They can't pull the carriages, and all of a sudden, same thing happened to the Germans in World War II when they ran out of gas. Trucks didn't go. When you run out of hay, your horses are going to get to the point where they're almost useless. Now, I have a couple extra minutes here. I have to tell you this story. I build carriages also. I consider myself a carriage builder. 5 of these carriages I've built. I built this carriage. Specifications say, Chris, I'm not even going to take a chance and use the pointer. Specifications say that you must put the name of the manufacturer and the address on that carriage. So when I got done building it, I said, well, I want to put something on there, but what do I put on there? And there were many, many, many carriage builders. There was probably 75 to 100 that they know of. They actually put the specifications for this wagon in the newspapers. And if you were a carriage builder, and at the time of the United States in 1861, there were over 10,000 carriage builders in the United States. And if you built a carriage and you could have a government inspector come, don't paint it until he says so, he would inspect your wagon. If it passed, he'd pay you $189. And he wanted you to put a U.S. on there, which meant it passed inspection, but it also had to have the manufacturer, because if there was some bad ones, they wanted to know that real quick. So I had to put a manufacturer on there. So I wanted to honor my hometown of Watertown, Wisconsin. I went back to visit Mom and Dad, and I went to the local historical center, and I asked, were there any wagon builders in Watertown during the war? And they said, well, we'll look into that. A couple days later, they called me back and said there was 3 of them in Watertown during the Civil War. I said, wonderful, thank you. I go to Mom and Dad, I ask them about this first name, they said, never heard of it. I asked them the second name, never heard of it. I said, well, what about Mesgatus or Messigatus? You can't see it, I'm sure, but that says Frederick Messigatus. And my dad looks at me and I almost fainted. He says, that's Uncle Ed's mother's name, Messigatus. I said, really? Didn't take me long. I was back at the library and I found out real quick Frederick Messigatus was my great-great-uncle. And the shop, the address, you can't see it, it says the northwest corner of O'Connell and Water Street. That is his business ad that he ran from 1857 until 1890. Never changed it one time. So I just simply printed that, took it out of the Watertown Business Directory, and put it on there. If you ever go to Watertown, Wisconsin, I want you to go to the northwest corner of O'Connell and Water Street, because the building that he worked is still there untouched. It's been classified by the state of Wisconsin as the most pristine mid-19th century building in the state of Wisconsin. I have pictures of it, and you can see those when you come to the Arsenal. In the 1890s, I've got pictures of it today. It's virtually unchanged. Other than all of the horse manure in the front of the building, because it had dirt roads, it's unchanged. And I thought, this is unbelievable. But now I'm going to tell you something you're going to say, this is made up in a movie. I contacted the Messigatus family. They have a web page. And I found my long-lost cousin, Margaret, whose grandfather was Frederick. She said, would you like to have the family tree? She sends it to me. I see all my cousins and all the connections. And then I got hit with a 2x4 right between the eyes. I said, I cannot believe this. He had a government contract with the U.S. Army to build the 1858 model wagon for the United States Army. So I tell people, for me to build one, I'm just following an old family tradition. And the factory or the building is still there. Every time I go home, I go out to his grave and we have a little talk. I tell him about my next project. But I said, if you put all this in a movie, nobody would believe it. I'm going to do my best. One push. There is one vehicle. Now, I put that up. I learned this from Willie Nelson. I worked in the Coliseum for 36 years. We did lots of concerts. Willie Nelson came one time. And when he came, Whiskey River was this big song. Everybody wanted to hear Whiskey River. So, you know, a lot of artists, they save their best song to the last, but they have the audience yelling all night long to play this certain song. Not Willie. Willie came out and played his big song, the very first thing, and people went crazy. Got it out of the way. Guess what song he ended the concert with? Whiskey River. Played it twice in the same night, and they went crazy the second time. So I start and end with the same. Some of you thought, I'm not going to go to that place, but you may have changed your mind. So that you have another chance to get that. But there's one vehicle I haven't talked about. Remember that 800-pound gorilla? The picture's over there. The ambulance. Why would an artillery unit have an ambulance? For 30 years, I've read letters, diaries of these soldiers in artillery units talking about the ambulances. We brought up our ambulances, blah, 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 blah. Over 30 years ago, I found some ordnance reports of artillery units turning in equipment. They're turning in ambulances. I've got diaries of people that joined the battery and they got out of pulling the cannon or the caisson and they pulled the ambulance. So I knew there's a connection, but I didn't know what it was. Until Terry Reamer out at the National Civil War Medical Museum told me about General Order Number 147. And that was issued by McClellan. It was issued in July of '62, and it said that every battery shall have one ambulance permanently assigned. That was the Army of the Potomac. That was copied almost instantly, and within a year or two, almost all the federal batteries had it, and by February of 1864, Congress in Washington passed the law that says every federal organization, every battery in the Union Army will have an ambulance permanently assigned to them. And since then, I have found many photographs. I've got probably one of the most unique research situations, and I've had people from the Grant Museum, I've had the Western Civ, and I showed them this. I have 4 photographs with the same man in all 4 photographs, and his diary, and he talks about the day that all 4 of those pictures were taken by Alexander Gardner, and in his diary, the battery that he's in is Cushing's battery. It was at the angle at Gettysburg. It was decimated. All the officers were killed. 70 horses, no longer serviceable. Only 1 serviceable gun. So for all practical purposes, on July 4th, that battery doesn't exist. They take this young lieutenant, send him to the 4th U.S., and they say, your job is to rebuild this battery. By the 31st of July, it was completely rebuilt and inspected. And on July 17th, he talks about going to Warrenton, Virginia, to pick up the battery ambulance. And in this great big 4-foot wide picture in my museum, you'll see the ambulance that he's talking about in his diary. I have a photograph of it. And I'm going to stop there, but I've got a million stories about that. I was lucky enough to find the great-great-grandson in California, and once we connected with that, his family class ring, if you ever go to West Point, the 1862 class ring at West Point is Lieutenant Charles Nelson Warner. His sword is on the way there, and it's just a fabulous, fabulous story to connect all the dots. But I'm going to, I've got a few more minutes yet. I'd like to put a plug in. I did bring a magazine. If you want to know more about the ambulance, I did write an article for the Artillery magazine, and it's in the spring issue of 2018, and I think they're online. But there's a pretty good story, and it has many of the quotes from the lieutenant about getting those ambulances and the battery wagons. So if you take a look at the article back there and you go to the Artilleryman magazine, I think you can get a copy of that. I'd like to put a kind of a pitch in. A lot of times, you look at that and say, well, Starkville is a long way up. I'm going to go there, for a couple hours. That's a long trip. Let me put this idea in your head. You come to the Starkville Civil War Arsenal in the morning. 4 miles from my building is the U.S. Grant Presidential Library. And to get from me to the Presidential Library, you have to go down Highway 12. There's a million eating places. There's Mexican, there's Chinese, there's hamburgers. So if you came to Starkville, you could get a 2-for-1 deal. You could come to the Starkville Arsenal, go eat lunch someplace in the middle of the day on Highway 12, drive another 2 miles to campus, and go see the Presidential Library for U.S. Grant. And I think you could have a great day in Starkville. One current project, and I'm just going to speak a little bit, and I'm starting to post it. Jeff, I see you every now and then on CivilWarTalk.com. I'm building a sweet gum mortar. a wooden mortar. Wooden mortars were used for the first time right here in the state of Mississippi, at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And I'm writing my chapter of Vicksburg, and last week at the Western Theater, I told all these people, I said, all of you know more about Vicksburg, but let me tell you my version of Vicksburg. Grant came to Vicksburg, couldn't fight his way in, said, I'll out-camp him. 1863, the war's costing over $1 million a day. He has these sappers, or these pioneers, working the besiegers, Grant called them, and they're working their way up. They're within 10 feet of the bottom of the 3rd Louisiana Redan. But the Confederates are up there lighting fuses on cannonballs and just throwing them all over the works, and they're eating their lunch down there. So somebody got the bright idea to make these wooden mortars. They're out of sweet gum, and after that mine explosion, Stuart Treslin was the engineer in charge. He made these wooden mortars. He fired 466 rounds into the 3rd Louisiana Redan in 48 hours, and that ended the siege of Vicksburg. So I tell people the wooden mortars ended the siege at Vicksburg. That's my version anyway. But if you come to Starkville Civil War Arsenal, you can see that wooden mortar. Where's Chris? Chris, at this time, I think I'm going to open it up. If I haven't confused you enough, maybe there's some questions that you might have, and I'd be willing to answer any questions. Yes, sir, young man.
I object to having to use a microphone. I have big lungs. Can you tell us about manufacturing facilities in Mississippi that made wheeled vehicles or?
Absolutely. To my shock, I thought, well, what did the Confederacy do for ambulances? And then I don't know how many of you know Gary Lancaster in Columbus, Mississippi. He's a very, very good researcher. He is, they're currently working on digging up 8 more Union soldiers in the Friendship Cemetery, but that's another story. Local historian Columbus, I see him every now and then, and he knew I was building an ambulance, and he says, oh, by the way, did you know that there was an ambulance building facility in Columbus, Mississippi? I said, you got to be kidding. He said, nope. He says, I got newspaper articles. Another ambulance enterprise. They built ambulances in Enterprise, Mississippi. There were carriage works in Vicksburg. So there were carriages being built in the state of Mississippi. Like I said, there's over 10,000 carriage builders. We kind of forget sometimes with automobiles, that was their transportation. That was their car, is to have a horse-drawn vehicle. I mean, you either had a boat, a wagon, which was pulled by a horse, or a steam engine. So that horse and carriage was very, very vital. And 2 different companies documented making ambulances during the war for the Confederacy, right here in Mississippi. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, what different species of wood were used in the manufacture of a wheel, and where were they used and why?
Very good question. The center, which is referred to as the nave, but most people call it the hub. There are several woods they used. White oak was the most widely used. Elm, if possible, but today we don't have much elm that is big. So the reason they wanted the hub to be oak, that takes the most strain or the stress or the pounding. The spokes are usually hickory or ash. And they're hickory or ash because those 2 woods have a little bit of flexibility to them. And that's why today in baseball, when you see a wooden bat, it's made out of white ash. If you ever see someone hit a baseball in slow motion, the bat actually is curved. It's taken quite a warp. And then the outside, the fellies or the rim that's on the outside is back to white oak. So oak, ash or hickory, and then oak again on the perimeter. And they all had their reason why they use those certain woods. I think we've got to have Chris has got to jump back there. I think the reason they're wanting to get you on the microphone is because you're being filmed and they want to catch the recording.
What brought you to Mississippi, and how did you get started with this collection?
I started probably like a lot of people in the centennial years. This group will remember Look in Life magazine. Looking Life magazine was full of Civil War stuff in the centennial in the 1960s. And when I was about 3 or 4 years old, there was a cereal, puffed rice, and they claimed that it was made by shooting out of a cannon. So if you remember this, for about $1.50 and a couple of box tops, you could get anything off the back of cereal boxes. And I got a little toy cannon, and I started playing with that toy cannon when I was 3, 4 years old. And then the centennial came along, and I started playing with, blue and white soldiers. And then my mom and dad made the biggest mistake of their life. They took me to an event when I was about 9 years old, and I saw some men, grown men, with a cannon. And I said right then and there that someday, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but someday I'm going to grow up and I'm going to get a cannon. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to get a cannon. And I like to think I was successful.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Since manpower was at a premium during the war, was the labor force, the slaves who were building the wagons and doing the blacksmith work?
Absolutely, absolutely. The slave labor, particularly in the Confederacy, they were digging trenches. All the earthworks and all of the miles and miles and miles of trenches were dug by slave labor. And they also took slave labor into Tredegar, which was the main foundry of the Confederacy, and they used slave labor in the foundries to produce the cannon. So yes, the very vital role in the Confederacy is to use slave labor. Anytime you have extra hands, and think of this, for every person that they could force into digging these trenches was another person that they could put a musket in their hand. So every soldier was being supported by slave labor through different, and they also were, acted as body servants and cooks. So yes, it's a vital part of the Confederacy's manpower operation.
I wanted to ask you about the Union armament. I'm assuming that the Northern manufacturing was superior and that the armament was superior in the Union Army. Is that assumption, in terms of lethality and accuracy and stuff like that?
Yes, and if you read the current Artilleryman magazine this month, they have a whole article on the Confederate artillery, and it talks about they just could not get rifled ammunition to work, so they were at a tremendous disadvantage with rifled cannon. They couldn't get the fuses to work, couldn't get the ammunition. I do one whole program on manufacturing. And everybody, the question, if you get a group of people together and they say, could the South have won the war? And everybody's got a different reason. I say no. And everybody's got a different reason. Let me tell you about one of my favorite foundries. It's called Cold Springs, New York, the West Point Foundry. That's where Robert Parker Parrott made cannon. Robert Parker Parrott, in one foundry in New York, produced over 2,000 cannon during the 4 years of the American Civil War. Anybody want to guess how many the Confederacy produced? No, a little more than that. About 1,800. So one foundry in Cold Springs, New York, outproduced the entire Confederacy. At that same foundry, they made 23 rifled cannon a week. They made 1.5 million projectiles. I have no idea what 1.5 million projectiles, but I did this. If you take the number of days that the war lasted, and it's only a few days short of 4 years, and you come up with this number, it's like 1,200 and something, and you divide that into 1.5, they made 7,000 projectiles a week. You couldn't shoot that many. So that one foundry at West Point outproduced the 30 foundries in the South that made cannon. And they weren't working up to capacity. They could have gone more, so they had no choice. Another thing is nobody ever thinks about the railroads. I think there's about 28 or 29,000, Jim, help me here, miles of track when the war started, but 2/3 of that was above the Mason-Dixon line. So to get all this supplies around the country, you needed railroads. You had to move it by rail. And the South was outnumbered almost 3 to 1 in miles of railroad track. So my version, because I look at it from a manufacturing standpoint, when the war ended, there were millions. I don't know if you ever heard of Francis Bannerman, but he bought up all the supplies after the war was over. He bought like 5 million artillery projectiles around. He bought millions and millions of rounds of ammunition. The North could have fought that war all over again just on the surplus. So the South could not manufacture anywhere close. And I don't know if I've answered your question or not.
Did they sell it? Did they sell it to other armies after the war was over?
Bannerman sold it to what he referred to kind of as third world countries. Even though the muzzleloading era had died after the Civil War, there are countries all over the world, and a lot of it's in Iran, believe it or not. There's a lot of it in South America, so you can travel the world over and see Civil War artillery because they bought it. That was some of their frontline equipment in the 1870s, 1880s, so it was well used decades after the war.
I was just thinking back, some of y'all here probably remember years back the last big reenactment in Raymond. It was a 2-day thing, and I shot video of that. And
I'm sure I'm in there.
Okay. One of my favorite memories was when it was over the second day, and I think that was an artillery unit, reenactment unit out of Texas, I believe was there. I may be wrong. But they lined up on the battlefield. When they left, they left all in order, came right across the battlefield to wherever their trailers, I guess, but they stayed in character. And I remember all of the noises and everything, the clanging and everything from all the wagons and all. And what I wanted to ask was of a typical field artillery unit, how many wagons would there have been on a tip? It was quite a spectacle, and I know this was a small reenactment group.
That's a great question, and I do a program, obviously, on wagons, but I tell people this, and they can't believe it. There's an excellent book on Holly Springs. And is it Beckworth, the author from Columbus? He's got a book on Holly Springs, and he talks about Mrs. Carrington Mason. She was a woman in Holly Springs, and she kept up with Grant, and she wrote a diary, and she talked about that when he left Holly Springs, it took 3 days for him to march out of town. But the wagon train was 5 days long. Now, let me tell you about supply lines. People kind of forget that in the North, you had the Army of the Potomac, you had the Army of the Ohio, and the Cumberland, and the James. There's 16 armies. Most armies had 4,500 to 5,000 wagons. 5,000 wagons at military specs is only 4 yards in between, covers about 22 miles. So behind every army of soldiers, there's 22 miles of blue wagons to support them. Sherman, completely unsupported, right? But he had 5,000 wagons. But remember this, just that little bitty battery of 100 horses is eating a ton of hay a day and 1,500 pounds. And you got 60 or 70 soldiers, and people say, well, they fed off the land. There are only so many rabbits out there. Yes, they did probably confiscate an occasional cow and some of the supplies, but that was not their mainstay. So the supply lines were the vital salvation for those armies. And guess who had the most wagons? Yep, in the North. A lot more. Now, Mr. Forrest and Mr. Stewart and Mr. Mosby collected up a lot of those wagons and then turned them into Confederate wagons. They didn't even repaint them. They kept the same blue. They kept the same U.S. on them. They didn't care. They got a free wagon, harness, horses, and the supplies. Anything else?
You might have mentioned this earlier, but how many horses to carry the average cannon? And
6.
6.
6 horses with good roads. Now, a road is a dirt path that's not muddy. If they had the proper food and water, they could maintain 25 to 30 miles a day indefinitely. Now, if the road's real muddy, you read about them being up to the axles, and the animals are so weighed down in the mud, they have to cut the harness and leave the animals to die in the mud. But 6 horses can pull those cannon 25 miles a day. I have read in some extreme cases where they've covered 40 miles, and I'm sure that was in the time of the year when it was light. You know, it's light at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and you can see till 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. But if you traveled 40 miles on horse, the next day, you weren't worth shooting. I mean, it was hard on the animals. But they could do it in an extreme condition. Anything else? Oh.
Where can you go see a live fire?
A live firing. The first one you can go, I'm trying to think. The next closest one, they're getting harder and harder and harder to find. We were up at Pelham, Tennessee, in the middle of March, and I think they're going to make that an annual event. I hate to say this, but as time goes on, it's getting harder and harder to fire cannon. We used to go to Fort McCoy in northern Wisconsin where that photograph was taken. 30 years we went there, and we were firing exploding ammunition on the military bases. 30 consecutive years, had 30 consecutive excellent reports, and after 9/11, the U.S. Army was very hesitant about letting civilians come on base with explosives. So it's getting harder and harder to live shoot. The closest one there is a shoot at Fort Hood and Fort Sill that they kind of operate every May. And then the one that's up in Tennessee, our unit, the Turner's Battery, we sponsored one for 15 years, and the person that owned the land. Now, if you have a great big pit with a real high wall someplace that we can back up 500-600 yards, why don't you come talk to me, because we're going to put a shoot on there, and you can sponsor it. Any other questions? Well, I can't thank you enough. Number one, I did feel like I was preaching a little bit, but I'm certainly glad that you sat through my sermon today. And if you don't ever make it to the Starkville Civil War Arsenal, at least you can visit online, and you can see most of this online. But you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for your attendance.
Thank you all for coming today. Don't forget to take a look at the materials that Duffy has over here, and help me thank Duffy Neubauer for this program.
Thank you. And I'm going to be here, so if you have that one question, that one thing you always wanted to know but were afraid to ask, I'm here. So thank you much.